This video is now in session, and for the past 2 weeks, Democrats have been openly venting in the media space whether or not Biden should be at the top of the Democratic ticket. Now, the fact that this argument has gone on in public for 2 weeks indicates that this argument is going to keep going on for the next month or so. But at that point, it starts to become counterproductive for the Democrats because the Democrats are now being seen as a party in chaos. A party that can't even decide in public, can't even show a unified face whether or not their leader should still be the leader of their party. So let's talk about this issue because we have some thoughts on this that come from a more historical perspective and based off of past precedent, and in spite of the precedent set in age that Biden has brought to this race, we still think that Biden is the best choice for the Democrats if they want to win. Now let's throw out some caveats here, right? This is a political perspective and a historically guided political perspective, not necessarily a moral one. The debate about whether an 81-year-old should still run for president is completely different to the argument that we're making that an 81-year-old could win an election and would probably win this election in this case. The other thing is that this is not an endorsement of Joe Biden. We're more looking at this from a Democratic operative perspective. So let's go into the reasons why Biden still is the best candidate. The first is incumbency. Biden is an incumbent, and people like incumbents because they like stability. Now, I get that some pundits and some people are saying that because of the rise of social media and because of increased polarization in American politics, the incumbency factor is no longer an advantage. But let's go into these arguments, right? The second argument, which is that America is polarized right now, is not necessarily a reason to go against this historically accurate idea that incumbents matter. If we go to the last period of American politics where you had such a slew of close elections, it was back during the Gilded Age, right after the Civil War ended. And if you looked at these elections, typically, incumbents won, even if it was in close races. Ulysses S. Grant was first elected in 1868, and he won in 1872. He won re-election. Then, in 1876, when Ulysses S. Grant did not run for re-election, you then had Samuel J. Tilden win that election by the popular vote. Now, you see here Rutherford B. Hayes goes on to become president, but it's a whole, I guess, the reason why is a whole different, historical story that we don't necessarily have time to go into in this video. But the TLDR is that when the incumbent was not running because he stepped out, the opposition did win. Now you go on to 1880, the same idea happens here, even in a close election, and then Grover Cleveland, same thing, close election. Grover Cleveland ends up winning, and he eventually wins re-election in 1892. And then 1896, William McKinley runs again in a relatively close election with deep resentment between the North and the South, even after the Civil War, and he won re-election in the 1900 version. So if we look at the argument that in a polarized time, incumbency doesn't matter anymore, that's just not supported by past precedent. The other thing is social media. Social media has given Americans a greater opportunity to see presidents at their worst and the opponents at their best. But the thing is, this has always been true throughout American history. Media has had the ability and has exercised the ability to paint the presidency and the president's administration in a poor light against the opposition. And you had a free exchange of ideas, a historically high level of free exchange of ideas at the time with radios back in the 1900s and yellow journalism in the period of the Spanish-American War. At that time, those mediums of newspapers and radios were seen as a precedent-defying ability for Americans to converse with each other. And now we have that again with new technology. But even though we have new technology, the theme behind it, which is greater freedom of speech has still run true and has still run the same throughout these past 100 to 150 years. So to say that social media would make anything different is simply not true, especially if we look at 2008 and 2012. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that presidents are judged for what they do in office and not necessarily for who they are. If you look back at the past presidencies and reflect on them, most of the times you'll know the presidents for what they did in office. Donald Trump, you mostly know him for COVID and as well as the social unrest that happened under his administration from Charlottesville to the 2020 George Floyd protests. George Bush, you mostly remember him for the Iraq War and the disaster that America was put in under those conditions. Bill Clinton, most people remember him for his strong economic gains during his presidency for corporations and for big banks. George H.W. Bush, most people know him, and history textbooks know him for being part of the end of the Cold War. Jimmy Carter, you can go down for most of these presidents. The only exceptions are presidents like Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, which are generationally inspirational candidates or presidents. For these kinds of figures, you know them for what they were able to do as a person. Barack Obama galvanized young voters to vote for the first Black American president in history, and Ronald Reagan galvanized conservative Democrats to vote for him. But the thing is here, neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden is inspirational, at least in a broad way, and that's especially true for Joe Biden. So that doesn't apply to that idea that candidate equality matters doesn't quite apply to this race. And we are more likely to see here American voters decide or reflect back on both of these presidencies for what both have done in their terms rather than who they are. Now we go on to the third reason. The third reason is if Joe Biden steps out of the race and the alternative in the Democratic primary becomes messy. How are Democrats supposed to coalesce? Well, some political pundits are posing this idea that Democrats have an open primary that shows the American public how the sausage gets made. It's almost this like fantasy portrait of showing Americans how democracy works. But the thing is, if we look at the past, what political operatives may see as an exciting period of political ideas, an exchange of political ideas, most American citizens see that as chaos. And as we've said in the beginning of this video, chaos is not a good image for a party or for a candidate. And if we go back on past primaries, this is especially true for the Democratic primaries. The 2016 primaries were especially heated between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, where you had a contentious convention and many Bernie supporters not supporting Hillary Clinton during the 2016 general election. Now, some people are saying that this is going to be different because 2024, Donald Trump is the main target here, not necessarily finding the best Democratic candidate. But the thing with that argument is that given the time frame that we have, 4 months, that is not necessarily enough time for Democrats to rally and unify behind one single candidate. It took a while for Democrats and progressives to transition from still supporting Bernie in 2020 to then shifting their support to Joe Biden. It took around 2 months between when most people thought that Bernie Sanders was going to lose to when Bernie Sanders did concede and when Joe Biden started to get the support from Bernie Sanders. And so with that kind of time frame, it's unlikely that we're going to have that same coalescence that we did in 2020 or that Democrats had in 2020. And even if they do manage to coalesce around a candidate, it's not necessarily automatic that alternative is much better than Joe Biden. Many people like to say Trump is easy to beat because Trump is so divisive. But it was very difficult for the Democrats to beat Trump in 2020. And many people, even though they thought Hillary Clinton was going to win in 2016 because of how bombastic Trump was, Trump ended up winning in a major fashion. So people are ultimately underrating Trump, and they're overrating many of the Democratic alternatives. Kamala Harris, for example, she is a woman, and for a lot of American citizens, they still can't grapple with a woman being president. If we go down the list, Gretchen Whitmer, same thing. Gavin Newsom is the governor of California, a liberal state that many people like to trash on. J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, his background is more from a corporate background, which is, for many Democrats, no bueno. So for a lot of the alternative Democrats, even though they might be able to speak better, each of these candidates have some kind of flaw within them that inhibit their ability to be generationally inspiring. And that applies to most races as well. Most races, when you look at the polls, or when you think about a current candidate versus an alternative dream candidate, most people are going to prefer the alternative dream candidate because they don't know about the flaws about the alternative until they know the candidate. All they know so far is just the flaws that they have with their current candidate. And that applies here in the 2024 elections. So that's the third reason. The fourth reason is that polls don't generally matter. They were inaccurate in 2016 and they were inaccurate in 2020. If you look at 2016, they had Clinton. If you looked at these polls, Clinton was winning by the mid single digits, 5 percentage points around. Trump ended up winning Pennsylvania. Same thing in 2020, where they had Biden winning by 4.7% on average. And if you look at some of these polls, it was as high as 9%. And yet Biden won this by almost just a little bit over 1%. So you can see here there are discrepancies between what polls are thinking and what the actual results are. Now, you might be responding to these mistakes by saying, well, the Democrats were overvalued in the polls compared to the actual election result. So shouldn't that be an even worse sign, given that Biden is now behind in the polls in the 2024 election? But the thing is, the reason why the polls were wrong in 2016 and 2020 are not necessarily clear and succinct, but the most likely explanation is a non-response bias, that Donald Trump supporters that there were shy Trump supporters who were not openly wanting to support Trump. Why was that? Because the media was portraying Trump in a negative light in 2016, and in 2020 there was an outsized support and a vocal support from the Democratic faction against Donald Trump. And so you see here that much of the non-response that came from these polls came from shy voters who didn't necessarily care for the personality of Trump, but rather for his policies. And now in 2024, it's likely that we see the inverse, because many Trump supporters are now very vocal about the candidate that they're supporting. And if you stack that against many of the Joe Biden supporters, if you talk to the people who do support Joe Biden, their support is much more quieter than Trump. And so, in that sense, the non-response bias could actually help Biden in 2024. But once again, the fact that we don't even know why the polls were wrong in 2020 and 2016 suggests that polls, especially when Trump is an option on those polls, is not necessarily going to make these polls accurate and an accurate predictor of this year's election. So that is the fourth reason. The final reason is that age might not really matter. At the end of the day, when voters vote, they vote on the issues that impact their day-to-day lives. You don't see people voting for Barack Obama necessarily in 2012 because he is the first African president. You're more likely to have supported Obama in 2012 because of his efforts to improve the economy after the 2008 financial recession. If you look at the 2016 election, in 2016, Trump's scandals didn't really matter because people wanted policy changes, especially with trade and as well as manufacturing in the United States. Obama being black didn't matter as much in 2008 as the financial recession that happened under Bush's administration. Reagan being old did not even matter that much either in the end in the 1984 elections. And you should bear in mind that in 1984, Ronald Reagan was 73 versus in 2024 where Biden is 81. And in the span of those 40 years, there have been many improvements to Americans' health, and the lifespan of an average American has increased over those 40 years. Again, there are arguments to be made that Biden is now having a cognitive decline, but you could go as far as saying that Biden is 90 and is experiencing cognitive decline, and you'll still have Americans who will, at the end of the day, in spite of Biden's age, see more into his policies and into the statistics that have changed between 2020 and 2024 with the economy, with immigration, and with a slew of other issues. Because if Biden dies, the VP does eventually take over. So those are some of the reasons why Biden should stay. Obviously, Biden is really old, and if you compare his speech between 2020 and 2024, it's a lot different. But there are always flaws with presidential candidates, and for most Americans, when they vote in November, their most important factor is the state of the nation, not necessarily the state of the candidate. And that's something that Trump could attest to right after the Access Hollywood tapes in 2016. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.